Good evening. We interrupt regular programming to bring you this breaking news update.
Ladies and gentlemen, buckle up, because what's unfolding in Washington right now isn't just another political scuffle. It's a moment where the mask slips and the true machinery of power in America reveals itself. Every time this government faces a shutdown, every time leaders panic behind closed doors, they tell us it is simply political disagreement. But you and I know better. What we're witnessing is a system fraying at its core, a system struggling to manage the very crises it helped create. And today, the stakes are higher than ever. Because the instant Senator Schumer stepped forward with a proposal to end the shutdown threat, Washington didn't just take notice, it trembled. Why? Because this wasn't a routine procedural move. This was a pressure valve being twisted open as the nation grows restless, workers brace for impact, and the entire political order feels the ground shaking beneath it. And just as Schumer makes his move, the other side fires back with one of the boldest, most disruptive strategies we've seen yet, sending shockwaves through the Democratic ranks and rattling the entire establishment. This is where our story begins. Schumer moves to end shutdown deadlock as pressure builds nationwide, and the aftershocks are only getting louder. Schumer's shutdown plan exposes deep rift in congressional power structure. The latest shutdown proposal put forward by Senate leadership has quickly become far more than a procedural effort to reopen the government. Beneath the surface, it has triggered a confrontation that exposes the fragile internal dynamics of congressional authority, unraveling a deep rift that has been building for years. The plan, framed publicly as a pragmatic and stabilizing solution, has revealed how profoundly divided Congress has become over its own role in the federal power hierarchy. What was marketed as a responsible move to end the political stalemate has instead illuminated a fundamental struggle: who actually governs and whose interests guide the machinery of the state. The proposal arrives in a climate where Congress has steadily forfeited influence to the executive branch. Shutdowns, emergency declarations, and unilateral directives have grown increasingly common as tools of presidential leverage, and each episode has chipped away at legislative strength. Schumer's plan attempts to reverse this trajectory by reasserting the Senate's authority as a negotiating body capable of constraining executive overreach. Yet the moment the proposal surfaced, it became clear that the Senate is not unified around this goal. The divisions are not simply partisan. They reflect competing visions of how power should be balanced within the government. Some lawmakers see the proposal as a necessary assertion of constitutional responsibility, a step toward restoring Congress as the central deliberative force of governance. Others view it as a political gambit that risks escalating tensions or weakening the party's negotiating position. The internal disagreement speaks to a broader crisis. Congress has lost clarity about its identity and purpose. The shutdown has become a mirror exposing long-standing institutional decay, where legislative authority has been hollowed out by years of polarization, lobbying influence, and procedural gridlock. The plan also highlights an unspoken truth. Congressional leaders are increasingly aware of the public's waning faith in their ability to govern effectively. Shutdowns are symbolic failures, reminders that the nation's lawmakers cannot perform their most basic function, funding and managing the government. Schumer's initiative tries not only to resolve the immediate impasse, but also to reclaim credibility at a moment when trust is near historic lows. Yet the very act of proposing a solution has intensified criticism from factions within Congress who accuse leadership of playing politics while ignoring deeper structural problems. At the core of the rift is the struggle over economic priorities. Shutdown battles are never merely about numbers on a page. They reflect the competing demands of corporate interests, military priorities, social programs, and the working population. Schumer's proposal attempts to reframe the debate around responsible governance, but it cannot avoid the underlying conflict over whose needs should shape the federal budget. Different wings of the Congress, centrist, progressive, conservative, see the shutdown not as an obstacle, but as an opportunity to fight for radically different visions of economic policy. These internal splits weaken Congress's ability to present a unified front against executive actions. When legislative power is divided, the executive gains leverage by appealing directly to the public or utilizing procedural tools that bypass congressional deliberation. Schumer's plan inadvertently brings that weakness into full view. Instead of rallying the institution, it exposes fractures that undermine its negotiating strength. The proposal becomes a spotlight revealing an institution divided not just by party, but by ideology, strategy, and competing interests. This rift also reflects how dramatically political incentives have shifted. Many lawmakers now operate in an environment shaped by media attention, fundraising pressures, and primary challenges. Cooperation has become politically costly while confrontation is rewarded. As a result, even attempts at pragmatic compromise, such as a plan to end a shutdown, can trigger backlash from colleagues focused more on ideological purity or political advantage than institutional stability. Schumer's proposal becomes entangled in these pressures, illustrating how the very mechanisms intended to resolve crises are often undermined by the political culture surrounding them. The tension is further heightened by the long-term trend of Congress delegating complex policy responsibilities to the executive branch. Over decades, lawmakers have increasingly relied on executive agencies to interpret, implement, and even shape policy. The shutdown interrupts this delegation process, forcing Congress to confront responsibilities it has gradually abandoned. The legislative body now wrestles with tasks it no longer has the infrastructure, unity, or political will to manage effectively. Schumer's plan attempts to restore order, but it does so within an institution that has grown uncertain about its own capacity to govern. This moment exposes a broader systemic problem, a government structure that relies heavily on a separation of powers model, while the actual distribution of power has shifted dramatically. Congress still imagines itself as the primary arena for national deliberation. Yet in practice, it has ceded much of that role. Shutdowns highlight this contradiction, and Schumer's proposal forces lawmakers to confront it directly. The resulting friction is not a temporary disagreement, but a symptom of deeper institutional instability. The rift in congressional power is not new, but the shutdown has made it impossible to ignore. Trump's bold countermove reframes the crisis and sends Democrats scrambling when the former president launched what has been described as his boldest move of the shutdown showdown. The political landscape shifted almost instantly. The countermove did far more than challenge Senate leadership or disrupt the negotiation process. It reframed the crisis in a way that placed Democrats on the defensive, undermining their messaging strategy and igniting panic within their ranks. The maneuver demonstrated a calculated understanding of political leverage, timing, and narrative control, revealing how quickly the balance of power can shift during moments of national tension rather than engaging with the Senate's proposal on its own terms. The maneuver bypassed the legislative framework entirely. By appealing directly to the public, framing the standoff as a test of national resolve, and painting opponents as weak or unwilling to defend the country's interests, the move altered the psychological terrain of the debate. Traditional negotiation logic no longer applied. Instead of discussing budget specifics or procedural steps, the public conversation shifted toward broader themes of strength, sovereignty, and leadership. This was a strategic advantage. Democrats had positioned themselves as defenders of stability and institutional order. But the countermove reframed them as obstructionists standing in the way of decisive action. Within hours, the narrative had been destabilized. Party strategists recognized that the longer they remained reactive, the more ground they would lose in both public perception and negotiating power. What was intended as a controlled, structured response to the shutdown threat quickly turned into a scramble to regain message discipline and avoid appearing fractured or insecure. The bold maneuver also exploited a persistent vulnerability within the Democratic coalition, internal disagreements over how confrontational or conciliatory their approach should be. Some members argued for a firm stance to avoid giving the executive further leverage, while others feared that appearing too rigid could alienate moderate voters. This tension created delays, mixed messages, and inconsistent public statements, all of which reinforced the perception of disarray. The countermove did not just challenge Democratic leadership, it exposed the fractures beneath it. In contrast, the former president's strategy demonstrated a unified front, decisiveness, clarity of messaging, and a willingness to escalate. By projecting confidence and strength, the move triggered an emotional response that often proves more powerful than procedural arguments. Where the Senate had attempted to emphasize order and rational governance, the executive leveraged urgency, identity, and symbolic authority. In a media environment shaped by speed and spectacle, this approach dominated the discourse. The countermove also highlighted the shifting dynamics of modern governance, where procedural legitimacy often loses out to narrative power. The executive branch, through rhetoric and public positioning, can redefine the meaning of a crisis, even without altering its material facts. This ability to reshape perception is a form of political force that bypasses institutional checks and appeals directly to the population's anxieties and aspirations. Democrats found themselves fighting not just a policy battle, but a narrative one. And in that arena, they were unprepared. Perhaps the most significant effect of the maneuver was how it recontextualized the shutdown itself. Instead of being viewed as a failure of governance, it became framed as a necessary struggle, one that required standing firm against political opponents who were portrayed as irresponsible or weak. This reframing shifted blame, recalibrated expectations, and placed new pressure on Democrats to avoid being seen as the cause of national paralysis. The bold move redirected public frustration away from the executive and toward congressional leadership, fundamentally altering the political cost structure of the crisis. The resulting panic within Democratic circles reflected the realization that they had lost control of the timing and terms of the debate. Their strategy depended on stability, predictability, and institutional legitimacy, conditions that the maneuver disrupted instantly. By dictating the emotional tempo of the crisis, the former president seized strategic momentum. In high-stakes political conflicts, momentum can be more influential than policy details, and once lost, it is difficult to regain. The countermove also underscored a larger transformation in American politics. Power increasingly resides not in institutions, but in the ability to command attention, shape narratives, and mobilize public sentiment. Traditional legislative processes move slowly, constrained by debate and procedure. In contrast, a bold executive action, whether symbolic or substantive, can alter the national conversation in a matter of minutes. This asymmetry gives the executive a powerful advantage, particularly during crises. Democrats now face a political challenge compounded by internal tensions, public expectations, and a rapidly shifting media environment. The bold maneuver not only disrupted their strategy, but exposed how vulnerable they are to rapid shifts in narrative framing. The scramble to respond reflects a broader truth. In modern political battles, control of the storyline can be as decisive as control of the policy itself. Democrats fear loss of narrative control as shutdown battle intensifies. Democratic leaders entered the shutdown confrontation believing they held the advantage. Public frustration with government dysfunction, polling that favored their negotiating positions, and a Senate plan they could defend as responsible governance. But the unfolding crisis has exposed how precarious narrative control can be in a rapidly shifting political environment. As the shutdown battle intensifies, Democrats are increasingly aware that their greatest vulnerability is not a policy misstep, but the erosion of their grip on the storyline shaping public perception. Narrative control has become a central battlefield in modern politics. The side that defines the meaning of a crisis often determines who is blamed for it and who emerges with momentum. Democrats attempted to frame the shutdown as a failing of executive overreach, a consequence of reckless political brinkmanship that sacrificed workers, families, and essential services. This framing initially resonated, aligning with long-standing concerns about extremism and unilateralism. Yet crises rarely unfold in predictable ways, and the opposition's ability to rapidly reframe events disrupted what seemed like a stable advantage. The moment the former president introduced his bold countermove, the narrative shifted with astonishing speed. What had been portrayed as an executive failure suddenly became a test of strength and resolve. Democrats found themselves cast not as guardians of stability, but as obstacles impeding decisive action. The complexity of legislative negotiations was overtaken by the simplicity of symbolic politics, where images of toughness, defiance, and national purpose overshadowed procedural explanations. The result was a rapid loss of narrative cohesion within Democratic messaging. Internal disagreements amplified the problem. Different factions of the party offered contradictory responses. Some demanded a hardline stance against what they viewed as executive manipulation, while others urged negotiation to avoid being blamed for prolonging the shutdown. These inconsistencies created openings that opponents quickly exploited. Public statements were parsed, clipped, and reframed to suggest confusion or weakness. Narrative fragmentation became a self-reinforcing cycle. The more divided the messaging, the more reactive Democrats became, and the more they ceded narrative initiative to their opponents. In a political landscape shaped by instantaneous media feedback, even small messaging missteps can create large political consequences. Democrats discovered that maintaining narrative cohesion during a shutdown requires not only clear communication but unified emotional tone. Yet the emotional tenor within the party was anything but unified. Some voices emphasized outrage and urgency, others emphasized calm deliberation. Still others focused on institutional integrity. Opponents seized on these contrasts, portraying them as evidence that the party lacked a coherent strategy. The fear of losing narrative control goes deeper than optics. It reflects an understanding that public perception influences negotiations as much as formal leverage does. If voters begin to view Democrats as partially responsible for the impasse pressure mounts to make concessions. If they appear indecisive or fractured, the executive gains freedom to escalate. Democrats know that their institutional standing is tied to the belief that they can govern effectively. A narrative of disarray threatens that standing. Moreover, the shutdown highlighted the broader challenge Democrats face in balancing technocratic messaging with emotional resonance. While they emphasize policy, expertise, procedural norms, and institutional stability, their opponents often engage in more visceral storytelling, stories anchored in strength, identity, urgency, and national purpose. In a political era dominated by emotion-driven media cycles, Democrats risk falling behind when they rely solely on rational arguments to address crises that evoke public anxiety. The difficulty of maintaining narrative control is compounded by the party's diverse coalition. A shutdown affects constituencies differently. Federal workers, business owners, social service recipients, and contractors experience different pressures. Messaging that appeals to one group may alienate another. Attempting to address all concerns simultaneously creates fragmented communication that dilutes the overall narrative impact opponents. By contrast, often focus on a singular message, giving them an advantage in shaping public sentiment. As the shutdown drags on, Democrats sense that they are losing the ability to define what the crisis represents. Instead of being seen as defenders of government functionality, they risk being portrayed as contributors to dysfunction. Instead of being seen as protectors of workers and programs, they risk being cast as political actors more concerned with positioning than problem solving. The longer the narrative slips from their control, the more difficult it becomes to recover. Democratic strategists recognize that reclaiming narrative dominance requires more than press releases or talking points. It requires reasserting moral clarity, emotional coherence, and political purpose. It requires addressing public frustration not with procedural explanations, but with compelling arguments anchored in values. And above all, it requires unity, because fragmented narratives drift while unified narratives drive events. Executive versus legislative clash escalates in high-stakes budget standoff. The budget standoff has evolved into a high-stakes confrontation between two branches of government whose power struggle has been decades in the making. While shutdowns are often viewed as temporary political crises, this one has illuminated a deeper and more troubling conflict: the accelerating clash between executive authority and legislative power. Each new maneuver in the standoff escalates a constitutional tension that extends far beyond budget negotiations and into the fundamental question of who governs the country. The legislative branch, once the dominant force in federal governance, has steadily lost influence over time. Polarization, internal fragmentation, and procedural gridlock have weakened Congress's ability to act decisively. As a result, the executive branch has gradually expanded its reach, using directives, emergency powers, and public communication to shape policy unilaterally when legislative cooperation falters. Shutdowns provide moments when this imbalance becomes starkly visible. During a budget crisis, the government's functionality hinges on negotiations. But if Congress cannot negotiate effectively, the executive gains leverage by default. This dynamic is at the heart of the current standoff. The Senate's attempt to assert control through a structured proposal represents a bid to reclaim legislative relevance. Yet the executive's bold countermove demonstrates how modern political power often bypasses institutional mechanisms and instead relies on public influence, symbolic authority, and strategic escalation. The executive's decision to reframe the shutdown as a test of will rather than a policy dispute is a clear rejection of legislative procedural dominance. Both branches are now fighting not only over budget details, but over the public's trust. Trust in institutions has declined sharply, and whichever branch appears more capable, decisive, and aligned with public sentiment gains long-term authority. The legislative branch, with its slow processes and visible divisions, struggles to project unity or decisiveness. The executive branch, with its singular voice and capacity for rapid action, capitalizes on this contrast. This imbalance shapes the public's perception of governance itself. The clash is intensified by conflicting incentives. Legislators must respond to constituents, party factions, and procedural obligations. The executive must respond to broad national sentiment and the expectations associated with leadership. During a shutdown, these diverging incentives collide. Legislators feel pressure to compromise to reopen the government. The executive feels pressure to maintain a posture of strength. The result is a constitutional tug-of-war where neither side easily backs down. At the core of this conflict lies the question of economic priorities. The budget is not a neutral document. It reflects competing visions of national purpose, resource allocation, and power distribution. The executive frames its demands as essential to national interest, while the legislature frames its resistance as essential to democratic oversight. These conflicting narratives deepen the clash, creating a battle not only over numbers but over meaning. The standoff forces government agencies into uncertainty, disrupts public services, and shakes confidence in national stability. Yet, even as these consequences unfold, each branch views the crisis as an opportunity to strengthen its role. The executive uses the moment to portray itself as proactive and determined. The legislature uses it to assert its constitutional role as the guardian of public funds. Both recognize that whoever controls the narrative of the shutdown ultimately shapes the future balance of power. The escalation reflects a broader transformation in American governance. Institutions built for deliberation and balance now struggle to function in an environment driven by rapid media cycles, polarized electorates, and centralized executive communication. The budget standoff exposes the growing mismatch between constitutional design and political reality. The clash between branches is no longer a theoretical concern. It is a visible and ongoing struggle that defines how national decisions are made. In this high-stakes confrontation, each side sees not just a budget crisis, but a defining battle over the direction of federal power. The shutdown becomes more than a temporary disruption. It becomes a symbolic arena where the executive and legislative branches fight for legitimacy, authority, and the ability to shape the nation's future. Shutdown fight reveals struggle over who sets America's economic priorities. The intensifying shutdown confrontation has revealed a conflict far deeper than a dispute over budget lines or political positioning. At its core, the fight exposes a long simmering struggle over who truly shapes America's economic priorities. While the argument on the surface appears to revolve around short-term funding measures, both parties are engaged in a battle to define the economic direction of the country, and the shutdown has become the pressure point through which this struggle is unfolding. The federal budget, often presented as a technical document filled with figures and allocations, is in reality a declaration of values. It reflects decisions about which groups receive support, which industries are prioritized, and which economic philosophies will guide national policy. The shutdown has forced these underlying choices into the spotlight. As each side attempts to justify its stance, it has become increasingly clear that they are fighting not only over immediate spending, but over the competing visions of the nation's economic future. Democrats have framed their position around stability, social programs, and the protection of public services. They present the shutdown as a threat to families, workers, and communities who rely on steady government operations. Their messaging insists that preserving critical services is not only a moral obligation, but an economic necessity, protecting millions from disruptions that would ripple through the broader economy. Yet this appeal to stability masks deeper disputes within the party over how aggressively they should push for structural changes versus defending the status quo. On the opposite side, the former president's bold maneuver has sought to reshape the economic narrative around sovereignty, strength, and national investment. The move reframed the shutdown debate as a fight against wasteful spending and misaligned priorities, arguing that the nation's economic strength depends on strong executive action and a willingness to take hard stands. This strategy taps into widespread public frustration over perceived inefficiencies, inequality, and a sense that institutions no longer reflect the interests of ordinary Americans. Neither side is simply arguing over the size of the budget. They are arguing over the purpose of the budget, whether government should act primarily as a stabilizing force supporting social infrastructure, or as a driver of national strength through selective, assertive, top-down priorities. The shutdown amplifies these differences by forcing both sides to defend not only their proposals, but the philosophical frameworks behind them. Beneath the partisan conflict lies another, less visible struggle: the influence of corporate and financial interests in shaping economic policy. Shutdowns offer a rare moment when the public can see cracks in the policy-making process. Lobbyists push behind the scenes to protect favored programs or subsidies. Industries dependent on federal contracts exert pressure on both branches. Each faction in Congress faces competing demands from constituencies with dramatically different economic interests. The shutdown therefore becomes a stage where the hidden architecture of economic power is briefly exposed. The escalation has also intensified scrutiny of how economic decisions are made within government. Over recent decades, power has moved away from Congress and toward the executive branch, agencies, and external economic actors. The shutdown forces all stakeholders to confront that shift. Congressional leaders attempting to reclaim authority find themselves constrained by internal disagreements and political fragmentation, while the executive exploits the moment to project strength and control. This tug of war reflects not only political rivalry, but the broader question of who has the right to determine national priorities in a complex, polarized economy. For millions of Americans, the shutdown is not an abstract policy debate, but a tangible disruption to their livelihoods. Federal workers, contractors, small businesses, and vulnerable populations face immediate economic impacts. The differing narratives from each side reflect contrasting views of the people they aim to represent. One emphasizing protection and stability, the other emphasizing resilience and decisive action. Every statement is crafted not only to justify policy goals, but to appeal to those who feel the current economic system has left them behind. The shutdown fight reveals that economic priorities are no longer shaped quietly through committee negotiations or technocratic planning. They are now contested in real time, in public view, through dramatic political standoffs that expose the ideological, institutional, and economic forces pulling the country in different directions. The confrontation highlights a fundamental question that the shutdown has made impossible to ignore in a nation of competing interests, fractured institutions, and rising economic inequality. Who ultimately decides the direction of America's economy? Panic in Washington as Trump's strategy risks undercutting Senate leadership. A wave of panic has swept through Washington as the former president's latest strategic maneuver threatens to undermine the authority of Senate leadership and destabilize the already fragile negotiations surrounding the shutdown. What initially appeared to be a routine budget impasse has escalated into a political crisis that exposes the vulnerability of congressional leadership and their diminishing ability to control the direction of national events. The maneuver, executed precisely at the moment when Senate leaders believed they had regained the upper hand, reframed the shutdown as a confrontation defined by strength, resolve, and executive determination. By shifting the battlefield away from legislative procedures and into the arena of public sentiment, the move put Senate leadership in an uncomfortable position, forced to respond defensively, rapidly, and without the luxury of unified planning. Their authority, built on careful messaging and structured negotiation, was suddenly thrown into question. Senate leaders rely heavily on the perception of control over process, over timing, and over the narrative surrounding key political moments. The countermove destabilized that perception. Within hours, reports emerged of confusion, disagreement, and quiet frustration among members of the Senate majority and minority alike. Staffers scrambled to rewrite talking points. Senior lawmakers privately expressed concern that they had been caught off guard. The political machinery of Washington, accustomed to predictable rhythms, was shaken by a maneuver designed to disrupt those rhythms entirely. This disruption carries significant consequences for legislative strategy. When Senate leadership loses narrative coherence, it loses bargaining power. Opponents sense vulnerability and double down. Allies become uncertain about how aggressively to support the leadership's position. Public confidence begins to erode. The sense of panic is rooted not only in the boldness of the former president's move, but in the realization that Senate leaders may be unable to regain control quickly enough to shape the next phase of the shutdown battle. The executive's approach exploited a long-standing weakness within the Senate, internal divisions masked by outward unity. While the public often sees the Senate as a slow-moving, deliberative body, its internal politics are anything but calm. Senators hold different policy goals, different political incentives, and different levels of risk tolerance. The countermove forced these differences into the open. Some senators pushed for a firmer stance to counter the executive's pressure. Others argued for compromise to avoid further escalation. The resulting tensions fueled the perception that Senate leadership was struggling to maintain discipline. Public reaction also contributes to the sense of panic. The shutdown has already created anxiety among voters, and the sudden escalation amplifies that anxiety. Senate leaders, aware of the political danger of appearing ineffective, face pressure from constituents demanding accountability and resolution. The former president's move positions him as decisive at a moment when the Senate appears indecisive. This asymmetry puts leadership at a serious disadvantage in both public communication and negotiation. Lobbyists, business groups, and federal agencies add another layer of pressure with each day of the shutdown. Economic and operational consequences become more severe. These stakeholders lean heavily on Senate leaders to reach a solution, but the executive's maneuver has complicated the path forward. Leadership must now navigate not only the internal politics of the Senate, but the expectations of powerful external actors whose interests are directly impacted by prolonged government paralysis. The panic within Washington also reflects a broader shift in American political dynamics. Traditional legislative authority is increasingly vulnerable to disruption by bold executive action. The former president's strategy demonstrates how quickly the balance of power can shift when one side controls the emotional tempo of a political conflict. Senate leadership, designed for careful deliberation rather than rapid response, struggles to adapt in moments of sudden escalation. As the shutdown battle intensifies, the Senate faces a test of its institutional strength and political cohesion. The panic stems from a growing realization: if leadership cannot regain narrative and strategic control soon, they risk losing not only this confrontation, but their long-term authority in shaping national policy. Shutdown drama unveils growing concentration of power in the executive branch. The shutdown confrontation has exposed how dramatically power has shifted toward the executive branch, revealing a system where swift, unilateral actions increasingly overshadow congressional deliberation. As the Senate struggles with internal fractures and slow procedures, the executive's rapid maneuvers dominate public attention and redefine the crisis on its own terms. The imbalance is no longer theoretical. Each escalation underscores how executive influence now shapes national direction more forcefully than the legislative process once designed to restrain it. Internal Democratic tensions rise amid pressure to respond to Trump's move. Pressure is mounting inside Democratic circles as the former president's bold maneuver forces lawmakers into a difficult strategic corner, intensifying divisions over how aggressively to respond. Some members demand a forceful counteroffensive, warning that hesitation signals weakness, while others fear escalating the standoff could backfire politically. The conflicting impulses have created visible strain within the party, complicating its public message and raising concerns that internal disagreement may undermine its leverage at a critical moment. Political brinkmanship highlights systemic failures in federal governance. The escalating shutdown battle has exposed deep structural weaknesses in federal governance, where partisan brinkmanship repeatedly replaces stable policy making. As both sides trade high-risk maneuvers, essential functions stall, public confidence erodes, and the government's inability to manage basic responsibilities becomes impossible to ignore. The crisis underscores a system strained by polarization and institutional decay. revealing how fragile national decision-making has become crisis sparks nationwide debate over government accountability and power abuse. The shutdown turmoil has triggered a national debate over accountability as citizens question whether leaders are serving public interests or exploiting chaos for political gain. Accusations of power abuse intensify as communities face disruptions and uncertainty, fueling demands for transparency and responsible leadership. The confrontation has amplified concerns about concentrated authority and a government increasingly viewed as disconnected from everyday realities when we zoom out and look at everything unfolding from Schumer's high-stakes maneuver to the aggressive counter. Moves shaking the political landscape, from escalating brinkmanship to rising public frustration. We see a pattern that can no longer be ignored. This isn't just about parties trading blows. It's about a system revealing its fractures under the weight of economic stress, social distrust, and political decay. Every announcement, every strategy, every late-night negotiation is part of a deeper struggle. A struggle over who truly governs this country and whose interests are being protected when the lights start flickering in Washington. The shutdown fight is just the surface. Beneath it lies a power structure scrambling to maintain control in a moment where the public is demanding more clarity, more accountability, and more truth than ever before. And as the nation questions how authority is used, why crises keep repeating, and who benefits from the chaos, one thing becomes unmistakably clear: the American people are tired of political theater and hungry for real answers. Answers that expose the machinery, not just the headlines. Answers that explain the forces behind these recurring crises. Answers that point to the system itself, not just the players caught in it. And that is why USA World Reports brings you this breakdown. Not softened, not filtered, but with the clarity and depth that these moments demand. Because understanding what's truly happening isn't just important. It's necessary. Stay sharp. Stay aware. And stay with USA World Reports, where we don't just report the news, we reveal the forces that shape it.